In the criminal justice system, the people are represented by two separate yet equally important groups: the police who investigate crime
and the SJW district attorneys who don't prosecute the offenders. These are their stories. Hello everyone, I've got 3 topics I'm going to be covering today. First of all, the state of New York has released thousands of criminals from its prisons to help protect them from the coronavirus. However, before releasing these prisoners, did New York State officials do even basic math to determine whether their decision made any sense? The second topic is the Federal Reserve is preparing a third financial bailout, offering over $1 trillion in bailout money to buy back junk bonds. My question is, why in the world would they want to do this? Finally, a December 2018 article by Weasel fake right-winger David French is blown the fuck out by new revelations about the criminal investigation in the former General Michael Flynn. At the urging of celebrities such as Alec Baldwin, New York State officials have released thousands of prisoners from New York prisons. Among those prisoners who have been released include violent criminals and sex offenders. Alec Baldwin is not any sort of public health expert. He's not even a criminologist or a sociologist. But nonetheless, New York State has either already released these prisoners or is scheduled to do so soon in the future. The stated reason: to help prevent coronavirus. Now, the logic behind this makes sense in theory. You have all of these prisons, which tend to be pretty crowded. You have inmates stuck in there in these small cells. And the idea is that coronavirus somehow makes it into the prison, and then soon everyone in the prison is exposed. It tears through the prison population. They all get infected. So by that theory, we have to empty out all of the prisons. However, as the hardest hit state with coronavirus, New York has the capability to use math, basic elementary school level math, nothing complicated here, to see whether prisoners are at a greater risk of contracting the coronavirus because of the conditions that exist in the prisons, or whether they'd be more likely to contract the disease if they're released. So that's exactly what I did. I calculated the infection rate for New York State prisoners as well as New Yorkers as a whole. Using Google, I was able to get the following 3 figures: the number of prisoners locked up in New York State prisons, the total population of the state of New York, as well as the number of New Yorkers who've been infected with the coronavirus. I was then able to get the number of prison inmates in New York State prisons who've contracted the coronavirus through a New York Post article that was posted in the last 2 days, dividing the number of people who've contracted the disease in both prison and outside of prison against the total number of people who've been infected. I was able to come up with the following chart. For inmates in New York State prisons, their rate of contracting the coronavirus is 0.5%. It's 0.5%. Now, if you compare that to New Yorkers in general, their rate of infection is 3.4%, significantly higher than the rate of infection for people in New York State prisons. In fact, if you are not incarcerated in a prison in New York State, you are 68 times more likely to get infected with coronavirus. Releasing these prisoners puts them at 68 times the risk of contracting the disease. To the extent that New York is prioritizing the release of unhealthy prisoners who have compromised immune systems, they're not helping these prisoners. They might as well be signing off on a death sentence. So how can this be the case? How is it that people in prison are less likely to get the disease? Well, it's not like there's nothing that prisons can do to protect its inmates from a viral infection. We all know the rules of social distancing. You gotta stay 6 feet away from everyone. Now, I'd imagine the typical prison in New York State has inmates grouped closer together than 6 feet. But what if the prison just emptied half of the cells? Just had one cell that was empty in between every one. Or alternatively, perhaps you have 2 inmates in a cell, but they're isolated from any other parts of the prison. At that point, all that the New York State prisons would have to do is closely monitor the guards to make sure they don't have the disease when they start their shift. Once these people have been released out onto the community though, well, their risk of contracting the disease is completely in their hands. If they fail to follow social distancing guidelines, then their risk of contracting coronavirus skyrockets. Given that criminals in general tend to be pretty disorderly, we're talking about New York State here. By the time that you're going to prison in New York State, you would have had to have committed a pretty heinous crime or have a notorious criminal history because they're real reluctant to send people to prison. We all know about how New York City abolished bond recently, especially if we're talking about violent criminals or sex offenders. These are not the sorts of people who you just release into the community and then they're going to follow all of the social distancing guidelines. Now, I can't predict what exact effect this is going to have on New York's crime rate. I can tell you that there have been articles talking about how many of these released prisoners have gone on to re-offend. With all of the social justice warrior activism related to criminal justice in New York City, with the abolition of bail, to the extent that these criminals are released from New York prisons and they go out and re-offend, it's going to be real difficult for New York's local government to send them back. They're going to face an uphill battle, a battle that many local officials in the city of New York, including Mayor Bill de Blasio, including several of the so-called progressive prosecutors, including the Brooklyn District Attorney, are not going to be willing to fight for. I believe that this coronavirus is being used as a pretext to convert New York City's criminal justice system to something that more closely resembles the criminal justice system that exists in places like San Francisco and Seattle, Washington. They want New York City to be like it was in the 1970s. Like what's depicted in the movie Joker. Now, this prisoner release includes some pretty odious people, including the creepy porn lawyer who represented Stormy Daniels, Michael Avenatti. Michael Avenatti is a free man now due to the coronavirus. Forget the fact that he tried to extort millions of dollars from Nike. Forget the millions of dollars in financial fraud that he committed. The fact that he owes, once again, millions of dollars to the US taxpayers because he failed to pay his taxes for years. All of that gets forgiven now because of the coronavirus. Of course, it's not just Michael Avenatti that's been freed, but so has Michael Cohen. Remember Donald Trump's attorney who did things like secretly record his own client in blatant violation of attorney-client privilege ethical rules? The same Michael Cohen who was involved in his own shady side deals in tax evasion, who the Robert Mueller investigation desperately tried to flip on Trump. But even though he wanted to flip on Trump, he had literally no incriminating evidence to provide. Yeah, he's now a free man. I guess all of that's been forgiven due to the coronavirus. But New York State can keep on doing what it's doing. I'm just a guy on the internet asking basic questions. Like, is it statistically true that you're more likely to get the virus if you're locked up in prison? Apparently, you're 68 times less likely to get it. But that just doesn't matter to these New York officials. The second topic I wanted to talk about is the Federal Reserve is preparing another bailout. This time they're going to offer $1.45 trillion to bail out junk bonds. My question is, why on earth would the Federal Reserve ever do this? How does it make any sense whatsoever? For those of you who are unfamiliar, junk bonds are high risk, high reward financial investments. They tend to go to newer companies, to startups that have a new idea for a product that hasn't been tested in the marketplace yet. As we all know, new ideas can potentially be very lucrative. Everyone wishes they would have invested early in technology companies like Google or Amazon. However, for every tech company that starts in the basement of a house in Silicon Valley, there are hundreds more that fail. So who exactly is it that tends to invest in these junk bonds? Well, they're the favored financial investment for certain hedge funds and investment banks. These banks tend to use a combination of sophisticated computer algorithms alongside good old-fashioned insider trading schemes to rank, invest in, and trade these junk bonds. Many of the managers and owners of these investment banks and hedge funds have managed to become obscenely wealthy off their ownership or managing of these funds. They represent some of the most lucrative money-making opportunities that exist in the entire world. That's because when these junk bonds are profitable, they're very profitable. So why on earth, now that the market is in the shitter, would the Federal Reserve even contemplate bailing out junk bonds? Now, back in the financial crisis in 2008, you had all the major banks get bailouts. Now, I don't think the banks should have gotten bailouts, but I can understand the rationale. You have all of these huge banks, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, and they're so involved in the US economy. They employ thousands of people. They're responsible for so many people's bank and checking accounts, so many people's credit cards, so many people's mortgages. That's why a lot of people who supported the bailouts would say things like, these banks are too big to fail. They're too integral to the US economy. Now, when the current crisis hit, the Federal Reserve has already bailed out all of these big banks under the exact same rationale. But here's the thing. None of the things that could be said about Bank of America or JP Morgan Chase and how they're too big to fail, how they're too essential, could also be said of these hedge funds and investment banks. We're talking about a small number of financial firms that employ a very small number of people in relation to something like JP Morgan Chase Bank or Wells Fargo. The average American stands almost nothing to lose if all of these investment banks and hedge funds go under, which once again would not necessarily be the case if Bank of America went out of business. That would affect a lot of Americans. In fact, it's hard for me to believe that with the absence of this junk bond bailout, whether there really would be any effect on the US economy at all. What this would amount to is basically a form of corporate welfare that only benefits the most extremely wealthy people in the nation, with no benefit whatsoever to the country as a whole. Remember, the reason these junk bonds provide such high profits if they're successful is because they're risky investments. If hedge funds are able to heavily invest in junk bonds when the economy is doing well, then they privatize all of the profits from these junk bonds. But then the second the economy goes down, they get a bailout from the Federal Reserve. Well, they've essentially socialized all of the losses. This is what I've been talking about in this YouTube channel when I say that the US economy is being run like communism in reverse. During times where the US economy is going well, hedge fund and investment bank managers receive billions of dollars in profit. They don't reinvest all of that money into the hedge funds. They withdraw it, treat it as profit, and take it and distribute it to the individuals who own and manage these funds. Then when a crisis hits, the hedge fund has no money to cover the emergency, and it gets a bailout from the Federal Reserve. So therefore, the fact that it invested in all risky investments doesn't matter. They're not assuming that risk. The US taxpayers are. So if you are an investor, why wouldn't you invest in the riskiest investments possible? The ones most likely to fail, but at the same time, most likely to deliver massive profits if they don't fail. Because if they do end up failing, then you can always get a huge bailout from the Federal Reserve. Speaking strictly personally, my wife and I still haven't gotten our $2,400 bailout stimulus check from the federal government. We tried to apply for the Paycheck Protection Program so that we wouldn't have to fire our employee, and we got pretty much nowhere. But now America's wealthiest institutions, its investment banks and hedge funds, are going to get $1.45 trillion. How is anything about the US economy fair at this point? Anyone who still believes that the United States is the greatest country in the world right now is a complete moron. The third thing I wanted to talk about is some new revelations have emerged in the criminal investigation into former General Michael Flynn. Now, a little over a year ago, in an article on December 14, 2018, so-called right-wing journalist David French penned an article in the National Review that completely threw General Michael Flynn under the bus. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the absolute weasel that is David French, let's put it this way. When the Republican Party routinely ran candidates like George W. Bush and Mitt Romney, David French was an enthusiastic cheerleader for right-wing politics. But after Donald Trump became the Republican nominee, David French was real eager to sign on to conspiracy theories like Russiagate. I can't think of a more ardent cheerleader for America's deep state than David French. In this December 2018 article, David French gleefully celebrates the fact that Michael Flynn will be sentenced to prison. In concluding his article, David French writes as to former General Michael Flynn, he is not, however, a victim of federal law enforcement. He is a man who did wrong and is now paying his debt to society. That's not exploitation, it's justice. David French also urges Michael Flynn to cooperate with the Robert Mueller investigation against Trump. Doesn't that seem like an odd thing for someone who identifies themselves as a right-wing journalist to do? Fast forward to the National Review today, and you'll see a new news story. Explosive revelations in the Flynn case. Rather than rely on some prosecutor from a partisan special prosecutor team, the task was given to the U.S. Attorney from St. Louis, Jeff Jensen, to review. Upon Jensen's review, exculpatory information that was previously withheld from the defense was quickly disclosed. The new exculpatory disclosures make several things clear. First of all, there was no adequate legal basis underlying the FBI criminal investigation and the former General Michael Flynn. Instead, the motivation behind the FBI investigation appeared to be an attempt to catch Michael Flynn in a so-called perjury trap. The idea was the FBI would interview him under oath, and if he mistakenly remembered something or didn't describe something correctly, they could threaten him with perjury charges, in which case they would demand that he offer up some sort of incriminating evidence that they believed he had against Donald Trump. Furthermore, the FBI agents violated Department of Justice policy, which required for them to investigate such a high-ranking government official to notify the Attorney General ahead of time. The disclosure also reveals a large conflict of interest and the fact that the same Washington-based law firm that represented Michael Flynn when he filed his Foreign Agent Registration Act paperwork was also appointed to represent him in the criminal case. Here's why this is such a massive conflict of interest. Michael Flynn hires the law firm Covington and Burling for the purpose that they advise him on what paperwork needs to be filed under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, and then it is the law firm's responsibility to prepare and file that on his behalf. That is the whole point of why Michael Flynn hired Covington and Burling. So then this criminal case gets brought against Michael Flynn, where the allegations are that he didn't file the correct documentation under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, something that he had hired Covington and Burling to take care of on his behalf. Now that same firm, the firm with strong ties to the deep state, strong ties to the Democratic Party, is then tasked with defending Michael Flynn when one of the defenses, probably the best defense in a case like that, is that the law firm gave bad advice or filed the wrong paperwork? Are you kidding me? Although it hasn't been firmly established, there are numerous references in the new disclosure to a secret deal that existed between FBI agents and former General Michael Flynn. Redacted emails provided as part of the Department of Justice's new disclosure refers to a deal that needed to be kept secret, as well as an undisclosed benefit that was not included in the text of the plea agreement. Now, from the disclosure itself, it's not clear what this secret deal was, only that there was a secret deal. And what Michael Flynn's legal team is saying is that secret deal was the result of the FBI threatening Michael Flynn, who, by the way, was not represented by an attorney at that point, but they threatened that they would not prosecute his son under the same Foreign Agent Registration Act if he cooperated with their investigation and pled guilty. In light of these new revelations, President Donald Trump tweeted that he believed that former General Michael Flynn would be completely exonerated by the end of the week. Now let me reread that closing paragraph from David French's December 2018 article. He, referring to Michael Flynn, is not, however, a victim of federal law enforcement. He's a man who did wrong and is now paying his debt to society. That's not exploitation, it's justice. Sorry, David French, that wasn't justice. It would be a huge mistake to always trust what the deep state tells you, to assume that every FBI agent is being honest at all times, to believe something like the heavily partisan Robert Mueller investigation was not beneath engaging in dishonest activity. Dinosaur conservatives like David French, who naively believe every single thing that the national security apparatus tells them is true, deserves to be left in the dustpan of history. Anyways, that's all I've got for you today. Hopefully I'll do another video tomorrow. If you like this video and you're not already subscribed to my YouTube channel, please subscribe.